Thank you so much for making the time to join us. Welcome. Want to encourage you all to share in the chat. Our hosts and panelists are able to see if you'd like to share your name, where you're calling in from, and something that has brought you joy recently. We would welcome that. We'd love to hear that from you. Welcome, everyone. So just to begin, before we get into it, we are just in an extremely painful moment. Many of us are feeling a lot of things all at once. It's been almost 2 months since the horrific attacks on October 7th, and many of us are still raw and horrified and scared and feeling hopeless. I know that I often feel overwhelmed and just desperate for the violence to end. So with all of these feelings, just want to take a moment for us all to breathe intentionally and ground ourselves. I know I need that often. So we'll just take some breaths together, in and out, just to ground ourselves. We're approaching the holidays, so we're going to need to do that quite a bit. In and out, breathing. So again, for those of you who are joining, we welcome you to this conversation. We encourage you to share your name, where you're calling in from, and what one thing that has brought you joy recently in the chat. Please do if you wish. And let's dive in. We are excited to have this conversation. We've been planning this for months. Shoulder to Shoulder, we are a national multi-faith coalition of religious denominations and faith-based organizations who are committed to countering anti-Muslim discrimination here in the United States. And really, our vision is to build a community, a country where all of us are treated with respect and dignity and fairness, no matter who we are, no matter how we pray or if we pray. And really, it's about building that vision together. And in this time, it's so important to recognize the ways in which communities are being impacted from many ends on this conversation, Jewish and Muslim communities particularly, but also those who are perceived to be. And we've been planning this conversation for months with our hope to develop programming that is relevant to our network members. And we're grateful to feature these incredible leaders, our panelists today. Andrea Hodos is the Associate Director of New Ground, a Muslim-Jewish Partnership for Change. They are based in Los Angeles and do incredible work building community there. Rabbi Esther Letterman, shout out as our Shoulder to Shoulder campaign co-chair and is the Union for Reform Judaism's Director of Congregational Innovation. Rabbi Bert Wazowski, who serves as the Appleman Professor of Midrash and Interreligious Studies Emeritus at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and also directs the Milstein Center for Interreligious Dialogue. And Rabbi Elise Wechterman, the CEO of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical Association. So to say a note about me, I serve as the executive director of the Shoulder to Shoulder campaign, and just wanted to share full disclosure. I am not Jewish myself, nor am I Muslim. I actually come from a Sri Lankan Catholic family background, and I'm married to a progressive Christian pastor. And fun fact, my brother-in-law is Jewish, and he and my sister are raising my niece and nephew Jewish. So this conversation feels personal still. And to set the context for this conversation, we've been, as I mentioned, planning this for months and months now, and that's a result of our organizational strategic plan to design relevant programs with and for our network members. What makes Shoulder to Shoulder unique among an ecosystem of organizations who are doing this work in different capacities is that we are primarily working with faith allies, Christians and Jews primarily, to understand the problem of anti-Muslim discrimination and respond effectively. And so, wanting to create programming from our organization that's relevant to our members, that's how this conversation came about. And though the horrific attacks on October 7th added a heavier weight to this conversation, the need for it remains the same. So as we approach the holiday this week and also beyond, many of our friends and families will be gathering, and these topics may arise. And so we hope that this program will offer you some food for thought. And as many of you know, additional layers of context, the Biden-Harris administration released the first ever U.S. national strategy to counter anti-Semitism in May. Super grateful for that important work. And they also announced their plan to work on a strategy to counter Islamophobia in October, though I must say it was very poorly timed. That announcement was very poorly timed, but still timely and very important. And this webinar, we encourage you to use the chat and the Q&A box. The host and panelists will be able to see the chat, and we're really grateful for those of you who are sharing where you're calling in from. We see folks from Los Angeles and Long Beach and Minneapolis, Minnesota, all over the country, Asheville, North Carolina. And thank you for sharing what has brought you joy recently. That is very meaningful to see. I know that our panelists appreciate hearing from you. And we'll do our best to incorporate, what you share in the chat with us, and or if you have questions and answers, use the Q&A box or the chat. Feel free to chat one of us individually, and we'll do what we can to get that into the conversation. So before we begin, I want to be clear and address some of the assumptions that we might be making as we enter this conversation. Many of you may have seen the title and joined thinking that we may be discussing one thing or another. And so we thought it would be important to kind of name some of those assumptions, what this conversation is and what it isn't. So to start, the title of this conversation, Addressing Islamophobia and Antisemitism Together, As a Jew, Do I Have to Choose? I think it's fair to say that everyone on this panel would answer no to that question. And we intended to host this conversation for primarily a Jewish audience who feel in their hearts and in their gut that the answer to that question is no too. But we want to say that we don't expect us all to be fully aligned on this. We don't expect to all agree, and that's okay. We know and trust these incredible panelists. We know their hearts, and we're so grateful for their willingness to have this conversation with us today. Another assumption, all panelists and I believe that anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, though very different, are all also two sides of the same coin. They're inextricably linked. And as our partners share often, particularly at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, they say, anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are two branches on the same tree of racism. And I wanted to bring up a framing for understanding the issues through the 4 I's of racism. I's of racism, and that's really ideological, institutional, interpersonal, and individualized. So just to name, both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia show up ideologically in the myths, the stereotypes, the disinformation circulated about Jews and Muslims, the false conflations, all of that, especially in this moment. They show up institutionally, though in different ways: legislation, anti-foreign law bills, banking discrimination, workplace retaliation, infringement of free speech. They show up interpersonally. This is actually the most common of what we see in media headlines or even witness in our midst. That's harassment, bullying, name-calling, defacement of houses of worship, deadly violence. And they show up internally, internalized, and that takes a toll on one's mental health, emotional, physical, and spiritual well-being when your own community is being attacked and interrogated for just being. So just to think about these issues with those frames, I think helps get a grasp of how pervasive it is and how we have to have a multi-pronged approach to addressing it. Another note to share, we all the panelists here believe that we have to interrogate the assumption that Muslims and Jews are inherently in opposition to one another because of Israel and Palestine. And in fact, many of us can see those relationships as complementary. So we'll hear a little bit about that. Not everyone, I think this is fair to say, and important for even all of you listening in, we're not all going to agree and be on the same page here. And that's okay. And we can model this, we can talk, we can explore, we can be curious about one another. And in our work at Shoulder to Shoulder, we're constantly reminding people that Muslim communities are anything but a monolith. And it's a simple truth that needs to be repeated over and over again, especially in moments of crisis. We can't say things like all Muslims believe XYZ, just like we can't say all Jews believe XYZ. Jewish communities are not a monolith. There are 3 Jewish religious movements represented here through our speakers, but we won't put the burden on them to speak on behalf of all Jews. This is not a space to pressure one another or our respective organizations to take a particular stance on the crisis in the Middle East. Want to note that. And on that note, too, a word on the space that we're creating here and in this conversation, we're wanting to create a generative and generous space where we assume good intentions of one another, and where we can be brave and vulnerable to ask and tackle hard questions, and recognize and honor that we're all learning and growing always in real time. So please, to our listeners, also to our panelists, be respectful of this space, use intentional, honest, respectful, and polite language that is invitational. And we won't tolerate, harassment of any sort. And if we need to, we'll remove participants, but we'll just, put you in the waiting room. And we also want you to know that you're always invited into a brave space long after this gathering. And our staff is here to work anything out with you one-to-one if you need it. And again, I want to invite you all to please engage in the chat, message me or someone from our team. Feel free to ask questions, and we'll do our best to get them in the conversation. And final note, we created this to be a webinar format, and we want it to be as interactive as possible. So we're really grateful to those of you who are sharing your names, where you're calling in from, what has brought you joy recently, and we invite you to continue to share. And it's making us smile as we read that, and also help us connect with you in the conversation. So thank you so much. So now, let's start. Let's take a breath together. I need a breath after that introduction. And let's hear from everyone, our panelists today, and all get our voices in. Want to start by naming our values as our guiding point. What specific values and ideals, faith and otherwise, draw each of you into this interfaith work? What tenets within Judaism and your own faith, sacred texts, theological orientations, traditions, symbols, rituals, inform your understanding of the importance of bridge building work? I'm going to pass it to Esther to start us off, our fearless co-chair. I'm so grateful. I just want to say to Esther for just being available all the time to share thoughts and ideas and workshop and process. It has been really meaningful to me, and just want to give thanks to you in this way. So start with that.
Thank you, Nina, and thank you for the blessing of bringing us together this week. Is this a speed round? Am I supposed to just go quickly? I mean, because I could answer this in this could take me 30 minutes also, so feel free to cut me off. I've been known to go on. There are a lot of values, I think, that keep me grounded in this moment, and it's both, I would say, the written Torah of B'Tselem Elohim, of what does it mean to be created in the image of God, that I firmly believe, in some ways, theologically, I'm really more of a Reconstructionist Jew than a Reformed Jew, but I don't believe in a supernaturalist God, but really a God who lives among us and a God who lives in us. And that every person I pass, whether they wear a Star of David or hijab on their head, our God lives in them. And so if I'm to take that commandment seriously, if I'm supposed to take that seriously, if I'm supposed to take the teachings of my faith seriously, then that means I need to look into those people's into individual spaces, and really don't see them as and not divide the world into an us and them. I'm really not loving the word they anymore right now because of how that's been sort of polarized us. But really that idea that fundamentally I believe in a God that lives among us and in us, and that we have more in common, therefore, than we do differently. And I'll end with this, because that's really the core text. Is I mentioned written Torah, but I also believe in something called oral Torah, which is that grew up alongside written Torah, which one of the mystics, one of the Hasidic mystics, the Sfat Emet, who name is the language of truth, who talked about oral Torah really being people's lives. And so it was also modeled for me among my parents, but also among my father, Alav Shalom, who died about a year ago, who, when I told him I was going to rabbinical school, he decided to tell me a horrible story about another rabbi who acted in a very racist way. And I said, Dad, that's not the kind of rabbi I'm going to be. You know, just because we can find racism in our tradition doesn't mean that everybody who engages and takes on the mantle of leadership is going to be racist in their behavior. So I also think that, you know, part of what guides me is the role models who have come before me, who have blazed a brave path in understanding that we need to be in relationship with each other, even most importantly, when we're feeling in moments of crisis. So those are the things that I wanted to share here.
Thank you. Thank you, Esther. To Bert, the only man on our panel, brave.
I'm honored to be here, as I always am, with Shoulder to Shoulders activities. Thank you, Nina, for convening this. And I want to thank my teacher, Rabbi Esther, for what she opened with, because her wisdom really touches me. You asked what motivates us, and I am motivated, like Esther, by Torah. I'm in my office at the Jewish Theological Seminary, which is the home of the rabbinical school of one of the rabbinical schools of the conservative movement of Judaism. I've been here for 50 plus years. I'm an emeritus faculty member. I served on the faculty for 46 of those years. And I am deeply moved by the literature of the rabbis, the ancient rabbis. There's a wonderful ancient text called the Mishnah from around the year 200 of the Common Era. And the Mishnah asks a very simple question about the Bible story in Genesis. Why was Adam created as one person? After all, God could have, by fiat, filled the entire world. Why one person? And the Mishnah answers its own questions, which it should do. It says, to teach us that no one can then look at his fellow and say, my ancestor was greater than yours. We all share a common ancestor. And therefore, we all share a common family. And yes, Nina, I think you said well, Thanksgiving is often a time where we share the love of family and the joy of arguing with our family. That's where we are. We argue with our fellow human beings who are created in God's image. But those two things are very, very central to what motivates me. Later, I'll talk about why Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. But for me in particular, that we are all common human beings created in God's image, as Esther said, that really is central to the way I am in the world.
Thank you for sharing, Bert. And I also just want to note, Bert has been such an incredible leader here at Shoulder to Shoulder. He is a part of what made this conversation happen. And so just want to express gratitude for his ongoing leadership in Shoulder to Shoulder, but also in so many different ways in his commitment to bridge building and interfaith work. So now to pass it to Elise.
Thank you, Nina, and really an honor and pleasure to be with all of you here today. Of course, a bunch of rabbis, surprise, we're going to quote Torah. So I'm going to also quote Torah, but a little bit of a different piece, which is that, as Esther and Bert so rightly said, our tradition focuses on the holiness and dignity of every human being. And I also think we need to think about the holiness and dignity of groups of human beings, which is sometimes a little bit more complicated. I was reflecting a couple of weeks ago when we were reading the Parsha in the Torah that tells the story about the birth of Ishmael and the eventual banishment of Ishmael. There's a phrase in which once Ishmael and his mother Hagar are banished into the desert, there's a phrase that says that God sees Ishmael ba'asher husham, exactly where he is. And I was struck by the fact that the Torah is a story, the Torah is essentially a story about the Jewish people. And so it focuses, understandably, on the Jewish people. It did not have to include that story of Ishmael out in the desert. It did not have to include all of the other stories. But for some reason, the editors of the Torah, and I think wisely and brilliantly, included that story and told us in that phrase, Ba'asher Husham, that God sees all peoples where they are, that God sees them where they are. And so for me, one of my challenges is, as a Jew, how do I live up to that expectation that I try to behave as much in godly ways as possible, which means seeing through God's eyes and seeing all people where they are and how they are, even those whose stories differ from mine and separate from mine. So yes, to each individual being created in God's image, but also every story is also something that God sees and that we need to hold closely.
I love that. Thank you for this wisdom. And I think it's okay to share that Elise has a piece that she will be publishing soon, and it's on this very topic of this conversation. And I just want to give that plug as it's coming out soon. And also just something that resonates with me of what you said is that we are constantly learning and growing, as I shared in the intro. And I love that idea of God seeing us where we are on that journey, no matter where we are on that journey. For those of you who are listening in. So now to pass it to Andrea, who is doing incredible work in Los Angeles through New Ground. Andrea, what do you have to share with us?
So first of all, I just want to thank you and Cassandra for opening this space, and just grateful for the panelists and everything that's been said so far. I'm going to go back into B'Tselem Elohim in the image of God in a moment, but Rabbi Elise, I want to thank you for that Ba'asher Husham. I feel like this is a central part of the work we do at New Ground, is being able to see one another where we are. And I think that this will be a theme that will be coming back repeatedly. So I'd like to just open, I feel so, I'm not connected officially with any movement. I'm an observant, egalitarian Jew, observant, I don't use lights on Shabbat. I don't drive on Shabbat. I lead services. It's sort of I'm part of the DIY egalitarian community. And my whole life is framed by Jewish practice and Jewish ideas, and it was a little hard to choose. So I'm going to share a little bit with you about our work. This past weekend, we convened the opening cohort of this year's professional fellowship, and I'm I'm a little emotional because we have 20 people this year. On October 6th, we didn't know if we had enough people for a cohort. On October 7th, I was sure we wouldn't have a cohort. And people have stepped forward with generosity and openness to create space this year. So I want people to know that is happening. And I was introducing Kiddush, Friday night Kiddush. And I want to say the first retreat is really laying the groundwork. It's skill building. It's relationship building. It's helping all the Jews to understand the other Jews coming into the space, which helps Muslims to understand Jewishness. And it's all of the Muslims sharing with one another what prayer means to them. For the Jews, it's Shabbat. That seems to be the central thing. For Muslims, the central organizing principle is prayer. So we introduce these to one another. And so I was explaining Kiddush on Friday night, and I was saying the first paragraph is about the creation of the world. It's the Jewish universal story and involves people being created in the image of God. And then as we get toward the end of the blessing, we hear about Zecher Litziat Mitzrayim. It's a memory of leaving Egypt, which is the Jewish peoplehood story, right? Up until that point, we've been a large family clan, but it's in leaving Egypt and leaving slavery that we become a people. And then we also talked over the weekend. One of our fellows really wanted to share about Shabbat as a taste of the world to come. And it's in these 3 points that I just felt a deep connection to this work, that all people are created in the image of God, that Jews, next to and among other people, have a role to play in realizing this goal of B'Tselem Elohim based on our own histories and experiences. And I want to be part of working to build that world to come, a world of justice and compassion. And I just want to throw in just one piece of Quran, which I feel really relates to all of these things. In the Quran, it says, "Oh humans," and this comes up a lot in our work, I'm sure you've heard it, "we created you from male and female and formed you into nations and tribes that you might recognize each other." And that idea of mutual recognition is at the heart of this work for me. Deep recognition, deep compassion for self and for others.
Thank you. Thank you all for sharing this beautiful grounding for our conversation. I think it's so important to reflect on our values and what brings us into the work. We don't do it enough, but starting there is a great way to connect. It's a great way to connect no matter where we're coming at in this conversation. So I want to ask a question around why should we care about addressing both anti-Muslim discrimination while also, you yourselves, your communities facing anti-Jewish discrimination? The context did shift and get heavier quite drastically over the last month. And Elise, you have been mentioning in some of our preparatory conversations how you've been processing this. So starting with you, why do you care about addressing both Islamophobia and anti-Semitism together, especially as both communities and are facing discrimination, dehumanization, disproportionately impacted by mis and disinformation circulating within and outside of these respective communities? Why do you
So thank you so much. My flip answer is, how can we not care, right? How can we not care? Because who wants to live in a world that is full of hate and antagonism and all the rest that we see? As it gets worse, we uncover the reality of how much hate and vitriol is possible in the world. How can we not care? Just as simple as that. I think, part of what you're asking is, how do I understand why I care, and how that may have shifted since October 7th and the attack and the ensuing war between Israel and Gaza, Israel and Hamas. That's been it's caused me pause and caused me to look really deeply at understanding my motivations for confronting hate in the beginning. And some of what I've talked about is the fact that there's a great deal that we understand about hate in the United States, and this is in the American context specifically, as stemming in many ways from a surge in national and specifically white Christian nationalism, white supremacy, and that the undergirding of white supremacy, as many people have said, if Eric Woolward has talked about, is actually deeply related to a core belief in anti-Semitism and a core belief in anti-Black racism, and that from that core stems all kinds of hate. Anti-immigrant sentiment, Islamophobia, anti-Arab sentiments, homophobia, misogyny, and all of those hates, and the putting down of anybody who is not essentially white, Christian, straight, able-bodied male, it comes from the same source. And so prior to October 7th, it was very clear to me that in order to build a country of that I believe in, which is a multi-faith, multi-ethnic, multiracial, diverse, sexually and sexuality and gender diverse, ability diverse country, that we had to counter that hate, and that we had to do it together, right? So that all of us who are experiencing that hate that is designed to drive us apart confront it best when we confront it together and in community and in partnership with each other, because it is essentially designed to separate us and coming from the same place. That is all still profoundly true. Nothing has changed about that, and we still need to work on that. And then what we have seen since October 7th is an explosion in hate. And sorry, my desk is going up and down all of a sudden. An explosion of hate and vitriol and nastiness that is coming at many communities, including our two communities, the Jewish and Muslim and Arab communities. Let's actually talk about them as three, because Muslim and Arab is not, it has an awful lot of overlap, but the Venn diagram is not 100% complete, that have been coming from lots of places around the world, including within each of those communities, right? So it is one thing to say we all have to fight against the white supremacy that is virulent and recalcitrant and coming back at us these past God knows how many years. That's true. And lo and behold, it's not the only place where hate comes from. And sometimes the really sad, painful place that we're all sitting is that hate is coming at us from within the very communities we are in partnership with and in our own communities. And so now we have to reckon with the fact that we are all not only experiencing this as victims, but we are all related in some way to people who are complicit. And so the obligation is even more profound to say this is not acceptable. This is not the country we want. This is not the world we want. This is not how we want to be. We don't have a choice. Our country, and again, in the American context, our country will not exist as the place that we want it to be if we don't fight these together, both externally and internally.
Thank you for sharing. Bert, what are your thoughts on this?
I think my study buddy, Rabbi Elise, has hit very well on a list of the negative things, what we don't want. And I would like to flip it over to talk about the kind of things we do want. Why I, as a Jew, choose to actively oppose Islamophobia. And I want to lay out three arguments in order of the least to the most. So for me, the least compelling, but nevertheless important, is simply self-interest. I would love to believe that if I oppose Islamophobia, my Muslim colleagues will also oppose anti-Semitism. That is to say, that would be good for me as a Jew. But the second argument, which I think is much more powerful, is a justice argument. To say it as succinctly as possible, it's just the right thing to do. I am a student, if you will, a disciple of John Rawls' theory of justice, and fairness is a big deal. So I think opposing Islamophobia, wanting a fair shake for every Muslim, is important to me. The third argument is a much more complicated one, but to me the most powerful. It's based in two verses of the Torah, one explaining the other. The first verse of the Torah is love your neighbor as yourself. There are those, I'm sorry to say, in the Jewish tradition that say love your neighbor as yourself means your Jewish neighbor. But this is qualified by a second verse in the Torah that quite explicitly says love the stranger. In other words, the non-Jew. I am commanded to love my fellow human being, and I take that very seriously. This is tied up in love of, as I said earlier, the greater human family. One of the founders of Shoulder to Shoulder is my brother, Mohammed El-Sanusi. And because I love my brother genuinely, what hurts him hurts me. So I'm against Islamophobia because that's hurtful to Mohammed and therefore hurtful to me. I also want to say that this is complicated for me personally because I have been challenged by Hamas. I have a cousin, a young cousin, who was grievously injured. They blew off his arm in the Hamas attack of October 7th, and he is now a hostage, Hirsch Goldberg, Poland. And I love Hirsch. I love the family, and I want him to be safe. And the best way for him to be safe is for the Muslim community to feel that they too are safe, that they don't have grievances. And I think this is illuminated for me because many of my colleagues know that my cousin Hirsch is a captive and have sent me notes of condolence and sympathy. And those colleagues include many, many Muslims, including Palestinians. And that to me is an essential affirmation of the work we do, that we can live together, be concerned about one another, quite literally love one another. And absent singing love one another right now, I think my message is clear that the positive commandment here is love.
Thank you so much, Bert. Thank you for sharing that. That very question, actually, why should I care about anti-Muslim discrimination, not as a Muslim? There's actually another conversation that we hosted not too long ago that Bert was a part of, alongside a Jordan Denari Defner, who comes from a Catholic background. So just want to also reference that, and we can share that after the fact. Thank you for sharing that. So to move from this piece around why should we care, I want to just shift just slightly. It's the same question in another way. Why should we work to address anti-Muslim discrimination alongside anti-Jewish discrimination? And want to start with you, Andrea. Why should we work on this?
So I'm going to take us right to this moment. This moment where every single party's fear of annihilation, of erasure, of silencing, it has all been activated for real reasons. Israelis, Jews whose families have Holocaust backgrounds, whose families were part of the Farhud in Iraq, who have experienced war and the Second Intifada in particular, the fear of annihilation that was brought up by the attack on the kibbutzim is deep. It's deep and it's real, and the fear is real. And we have people in our network. Hirsch is a friend of my son's, Bert. And we have people who lost congregants, Jewish rabbis lost congregants, and we have Palestinians who have family on the ground in Gaza, and none of them have lost fewer than 40 family members. So there is just deep pain, there is deep anger, there is deep fear there, right? And there's also the message that Jewish diaspora folks and Palestinian diaspora folks are feeling, right? Just a lot of annihilation trauma for Jews, a lot of, silencing, erasure, and sure, just leave, go to Egypt now for a little bit and then you can come back, is not something that Palestinians can hear in a way that they can believe at all. And then for us, also Muslims post 9/11 here in the US, every year I think I understand the impact of 9/11 on Muslims, and then I learned something new. I learned something deeper. And that silencing that fear of losing jobs, that fear of being taken by law enforcement, it's real, and it's like all of these things have been triggered, and they're all happening to one degree or another. And so just being aware of that, I think, is really important. And remembering that when we are isolated in our own fear and our own silos, we believe that we are the only people at risk. We feel like the other side, we see them even more, this was addressed before, but we see them even more as monoliths. As humans, we always see our own communities as variegated. And it's harder to see communities we don't know as variegated. And it's even harder when there's history between us. And when that history has been triggered the way it has, it makes it even more dangerous. And our reactions and our counter reactions in this moment are making all of us less safe. That doesn't mean the fear isn't real and valid. It doesn't mean that the anger isn't real and isn't valid. In a little bit, I'd like to talk about the role of disgust and the role of contempt, which I think is the real on-ramp to dehumanization, and we need to be working past that. And it is self-preservation, Bert, in the deepest sense. And I don't mean just self-preservation for Jews or just self-preservation for Palestinians. It's like mutual self-preservation to be able to see one another's humanness.
So profound what you're sharing. And, I've always, with Shoulder to Shoulder, we talk about this fear piece often. We have this training, Faith Over Fear. And I've always struggled with that title. But with fear, you illuminated what happens when we come at it from a place of fear. It's that fight, flight, or freeze, the trigger, the trauma, and the rawness that comes out and how we respond. But when we come at it from this place of faith, whether that be oriented within our religious traditions or even just hope and possibility for change, rooted in values beyond, that there's this ability to see and think in a way that is creative, that the fear brain doesn't allow. And so that's something that is coming from what you're sharing, that's important to note. Elise, what are your thoughts here? I mean, Esther, I'm so sorry. Esther, tell me, let's hear your voice in there.
I'm so grateful to Andrea for starting. I'm somewhat at a loss for words, which is sometimes unusual for me and for rabbis. I want to dive into the fear part. So I want to think about how I've been processing the fear part, because it does, as Andrea talked about, it is connected to why I don't just have values, but also why I feel like I have to do this work. And it goes to this, my children. So I went back and looked at some remarks I made about anti-religious bigotry from 2 years ago, and I was sort of shocked at how much has changed and how much hasn't changed. Meaning, I told some stories about how my husband, since Pittsburgh and Colleyville, right, was already in alarmed state over bringing our kids to synagogue.
Esther, can you explain Pittsburgh and Colleyville to the...
Sure. So a reminder that in October of 2018, Robert Bowers entered this congregation called Tree of Life that actually hosted a number of congregations and killed 11 Jews while at worship. So that was Pittsburgh in October of 2018, the worst attack on Jews on American soil in a collective way. Right, like there were a number of Jews who were killed in other instances, but this was a pure hate attack on Jews. And then I'm blanking on the year, but I think it was 2022. Rabbi Charlie Citron Walker and 2 of his congregants were held hostage in their congregation in Colleyville, Texas, by a man who, thought we would have some power in helping him deal with an American family issue. So already there was fear in my family. And I'm sure lots of families had to navigate the fear. We come at fear very differently. We have, and the response has been, and so therefore, in the negotiation I have a 12-year-old son and a 10-year-old daughter. My son's bar mitzvah is in less than a year, the bar mitzvah in which he will be called to Torah as a Jewish man. God help us all. I keep saying to my husband why he has to go to temple more often, and he's petrified to allow me to bring my children to congregations since October 7th. And I had a breaking moment when but he's allowing it. Like, I mean, he there's only so much he can say no to. So I was wearing a t-shirt last Tuesday that said peace is possible. It was the only sort of outward facing shirt I had that I felt that I like, you know, I didn't have a two-state solution one. I didn't have a like pro-Palestinian, pro-Israel, like, and it just said peace is possible. And he said it in English, it said it in Hebrew, and it said it in Arabic. And my son looked at it and he said, Arabic? He's like, I thought they don't like us. And I, like part of me was like, he's not saying this meanly. He's saying this like really from a place of ignorance on some level. And I, you know, had to explain it to him. Like, I understand why you might think that. We had a whole conversation on the ride home. And all I can think about is the world I am bequeathing to my children and the children of my fellow Americans. My kids go to school with Black children, they go to school with Asian children, they go to school with children who celebrate Ramadan and Diwali, and all these other holidays. And I am fearful for their future. I mean, I still think I have something to say about their future. Like, I'm not ready to just pass it on to the next generation, but I can't, it so scares me that that's their future, that they're going to have to be in fear of Arabic or Muslim kids, are going to have to be in fear of Jews. Like, that is just not, I should name it. I'm an immigrant from Canada. You know, in some ways, actually, I dealt more with anti-Semitism in Canada than I did with America. And I came to America on some level to have a freer religious experience as a Jew. And so my heart is breaking a little bit that like, this is what's happening. And I just don't believe that the solution is therefore to go into my bunker. And so the fight that goes on in my own family and that I see happening in the community is exactly that phrase, Nina, faith over fear. So I'll bring in some more text. Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, you know, famous Hasidic teacher who has this famous song, prayer, all the world is a narrow bridge. And the main thing, as we translate it, is not to be afraid. The truth is that that's a there is a belief that's actually not what he said, that the Hebrew was not lo lepached klal, not to be afraid, but actually not to let the fear paralyze you. In the Hebrew, it was supposed to be lo lehit pached klal. It was supposed to be a self-reflective verb. That actually the world as a whole is a narrow bridge. And the main thing is not to be paralyzed by our fear. So for me, the idea of faith over fear is take the resources we have, take the resilience of our traditions, and be brave. The biblical ancestors were brave. Sarah and Abraham, Moses, Rebecca and Isaac, they were brave people. And I believe that I know less about other faith traditions, but I believe there were brave leaders in those spaces, and we have to be brave. And the only way, you know, I'm thinking of you, Elise, maybe you can say more about this because I heard you say this. We have to be brave together. If only one of us is brave. Anyway, so I'm not used to being afraid. Like, I'll admit, I'm like the risk taker, you know. I'm not used to being afraid, but I've had to acknowledge that as a Jew, it is okay to be afraid. I've been more afraid as a woman, put it this way, than I have been as a Jew. Partially, I'm white. I have economic privilege. So I've experienced more fear as a woman, but not as a Jew. And now I have it as a Jew, and I don't want my kids to have it. And I can't bequeath this future to them. Anyway, I'll stop now.
Yeah, no. And Elise, I see you wanting to come in too. Go ahead.
Is it okay for me?
Yes, please.
And I think I'm going to push this even further, Esther, because I think you mean this too. Tell me if I'm putting words in your mouth. Not only do we not want our kids to be afraid, but we also don't want our kids to be the source of fear. Right? We don't want our kids to be the source of fear. And this is the thing that I think we need to push home to. I used to say, this is going to sound somewhat terrible, but I used to say that, you know, I have a daughter and I have a son. They're in their 20s, they're older. They're not, I don't have so much say over them anymore. But I used to say that, you know, I carried around a lot of fears about what my daughter would experience in life, what would be done to her. And then I carried around a lot of fears about what my son might do to to others, particularly women. And that as a feminist parent, my job was to make sure that my son did not inflict fear and pain on women, right? And so I feel like this is that moment that's calling us to say the same thing. Like, not only do I not want your children to be afraid of people who are not like them, I don't want any of our children to be the source of fear for anybody else. And that feels really important to hone in on at this moment.
Thank you for saying that, Elise. I have to tell you that you saying that, I was at the pro-Israel rally last week. It feels like 100 years ago. It was very hard for me. It was very complicated. We don't have to get into it. But as I was leaving, I was getting on the Smithsonian metro station in DC. For those of you who know the DC, it was crowded, very crowded, mostly Jews, right? Wearing, carrying things. And I saw a woman in a hijab go down the escalator, and I got very nervous. Not for the Jew. I got very nervous for her. And I hovered a little bit near her because I was wearing the peace as possible shirt. I was not carrying paraphernalia. And because because there's a part of me that the duality of not wanting to be afraid, and I don't want to be the source of fear for another person who identifies as a Muslim, who might seem a Muslim but is not, because we still don't understand the difference between like Muslims and Sikhs, or etc. And at my congregation, one of our guards, we've had to increase, is a Black Muslim woman. She wears a hijab, and she's new to our congregation. And I came up to her that first Shabbat, and I just looked in her eyes and I just said, "Thank you. Like, thank you. I'm like grateful that you are doing this." And also, like, I said, I didn't want to get into the politics of it necessarily, but like, I just want to tell her, I see you. I see you here. I am so grateful, because I don't want her to be afraid either, that she is like putting her life on the line for Jews. Whatever we might, and recognizing that, you're protecting people who want to be in it with you anyway. So thank you for saying that.
Definitely to all that is being shared. And, something that is coming out to me, for me, that is really profound, is this importance of multi-generational learning and remembering what the hopes and dreams and examples of our ancestors, the hopes and dreams and examples and, even hopes that we have for our children, and what those links mean, and how we can continue to be in conversation, among one another across generations, and how that gives us hope, how that gives us motivation, how that also really challenges us, in moments like this. Thank you for sharing. So I want to ask a question about repair. A lot of harm has been done, here at home and across the world. This goes for internal conversations within the Jewish community and within our own families and close circles, and externally, among folks of different backgrounds, Muslims, Palestinians, Christians, and interfaith partners. How can we repair when harm has been done? And, I want to talk about that individually, and also, within groups and organizations, and, representatives of government, all of the different ways in which harm has been done and committed. How can we repair? Where do we go? And especially when it feels above us, it feels like we're like hopeless. We don't know what to do. Or does it even matter? All of that. What are some lessons to learn on how to repair? Start with you, Elise.
It's so hard. And I want to say that we're having a conversation, and I've seen some of the comments in the chat. We're having a conversation that is mostly centered around Islamophobia and anti-Semitism in the United States, in North America, that is profoundly impacted by events in the world, events in the Middle East, and has an impact there. We are not going to be addressed. We in this panel right now, some of us have very strong opinions, but we're not addressing the conflict between Israel and Palestine, Israeli Jews and Arabs and Muslims in the Middle East right now. And I think it is also relevant to hold that in the background, and to say that the first step for repair has to be acknowledging that harm has been committed. And that is sometimes really hard, right? So, I can't even imagine how that conversation takes place over there. I imagine deeply how that conversation takes place here, which is to say, to understand that I have hurt someone takes a huge amount of vulnerability and trust on my part, which is absolutely necessary, and lack of trust and lack of vulnerability doesn't get me off the hook, right? Like, it's my job, and this is true for anybody who is responsible for harm, to figure out what I need to be grounded so that I can hear and understand the harm that I've committed. That is step one. If we don't agree that harm has happened, then we're not having a conversation. And then, of course, our tradition tells us lots of things about how to address harm, right? Once we understand that the harm has been committed and we stop doing it, right? That's like step one, stop doing the harm. And then figuring out how to repair the damage that has been done. And then finding a way to make sure that it never happens again. Like Maimonides teaches us all these steps. We know how to do that. But the first step of acknowledging harm feels to me the most profoundly important step, because what it requires in order to be done right is an acknowledgement of the humanity of all parts, of all people involved. It requires the victims, those who have been hurt, to be seen in their fullness. And it also requires those who perpetrate harm to be seen in their fullness. And guess what? Fullness is about being imperfect, right? We're not God. We are imperfect. We aspire to be godly, but we are not. We are imperfect. And understanding our own imperfection and capacity to learn and to do better is a place that will get us far. And so that requires a certain amount of humility, vulnerability, and inner trust that our soundbite world is not made for. So one other thing I'll say before you ask the next person to respond, we also have to not do this in sound bites or through social media or in newspapers, right? This is about relationships that take time and care and patience and mistakes. And that's not, our world is not set up for it, and we have to fight back against the inclination to try to make it all okay in a Facebook post. It just isn't going to happen. It can't.
Wow. Yes. Wisdom. All of us are just like, yes, we can't do it in a soundbite. Absolutely. Absolutely. Andrea, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, so much in there, Elise. Thank you. I think in this case, often we're being our communities, our Facebook communities, our religious communities, our cultural communities are often requiring us to step into a binary where all of the harm has been done to us and we've done no harm to others. And I want to say, in this moment, there are people who are in direct physical danger right now, and personal, deep pain. And a lot of what I'm asking people to do, those people may not be ready to do yet. I want to acknowledge that and say that really right now I'm speaking, as you were saying, Elise, we're really figuring out how here in America, we can ensure that our communities are not causing greater harm to one another, which will then come back at us. That's my goal here. So I want to name that. I want to, so which means, like, if we go to this moment where there are places where I and my community have been harmed, and there are places where I and my community have been harming others. It's important to note that all of those themes are present. And that is also a really important place to start from. And then to be able to own the harm that we might have done. And someone here said something that really spoke to me. Pam said, what I need to be grounded, to accept and acknowledge the harm I've committed, is to give myself deep compassion for my own humanity. If I don't give myself compassion, I will be defensive. And this is the, right, so if I am only for myself, who am I? If I'm not for myself, what am I? Right, this is Hillel's teaching, and then the third part as, if not now, when, right? So this, we do a lot of this work, and I mentioned it before, of deep compassion for self, anchoring in compassion for your own, whether it's you're in conflict with somebody in your own community, you're a Jew who's in conflict with other Jews, you need to anchor yourself in compassion for your own views, and then be open to the views of the others who you may not agree with. And certainly if we're looking at cross-communal ties, we need to do the same thing. And that my acknowledging that I see how you've been harmed and I feel it and I acknowledge your humanity can create a space for other people to step into. But if you're staying in that defensive position and you're just yelling at one another from across the great divide, nothing will change and no one will feel better and nothing will be healed. And healing it's hard to think about healing in many ways right now, but also because there is so much stuff that is happening right now, physically in this moment. It's hard to imagine talking about this stuff for some people. So you might not be in a place where you can talk right now. I'm going to assume that most people who are here in a place where they can that can be part of what they're doing, along with whatever activism they're doing that they feel is right. So if you're here, you're willing to talk. That's my assumption. And I think that's all I'll say for now. And there's some stuff that will come back in a little bit.
Yeah, there's a question that came up, in the midst of this piece. And it's, what about folks that are within our circles and our families and in the different spaces that we're in that are not ready for relationship building and interfaith dialogue right now? What are some of the precursors to those steps when folks are still in so much pain? And just to get some voices in, let's hear from you, Bert, if you have thoughts on that. I know the resources that you've put together over the years, like Sharing the Well is one of many, and you might have some tips. What are some precursors there for people who are not ready in this moment?
First of all, thank you. I wish I had a copy of Sharing the Well to hold up. It's called Sharing the Well, a resource guide for Jewish and Muslim engagement. And it's available for free download. I'm gonna speak to three things. The first one being harm, because that has been what we've been talking about. And I think it also relates to how do we deal with people who just aren't quite ready? They're still hurting too much. Silence can also harm people. I think if we are silent and not calling out the sins of others or our own sins, that can create harm. And I want to say, in my own trajectory, I mentioned earlier that my young cousin Hirsch was harmed and taken captive. And I have been writing almost everybody who writes me, please pray for the safe return of Hirsch and the other captives. And in the last couple of weeks, I have also added, and I think it's necessary, please pray for the safety of innocent Palestinian civilians, because we have to be compassionate to all human beings, and there are Palestinians who are being harmed as well. I can't stay silent in the face of that. And when someone is not quite ready, well, I have to have some compassion for them, but I also have to let them know that they have obligations as well to speak out. The second thing I want to point to is Elise mentioned Maimonides. And Maimonides, for those of you who don't know, is pretty universally regarded as one of the greatest Jewish thinkers who's ever lived. And I would say 90% of what Maimonides wrote, he wrote in Arabic. Arabic is a Jewish language. And I think it's exceptionally important that we recognize that. Arabic is a Jewish language even in Israel today, because so many Jews there are Arabic speakers as well as Hebrew speakers. So let's own that, and that we have something in common with our Arab brothers and sisters. The third thing is to relate to, Nina, what you, I think, very astutely named, which is our intergenerational concerns. I'm old enough not only to have children, but also grandchildren. So let me tell a little story, because I'm always in touch with my children. And after the election, immediately after the election in 2016, when the government changed hands from the Obama administration, I wrote my children the following. I said, sometimes I feel like Sisyphus pushing the rock up the hill every day. And with this election, the rock got a lot bigger and the hill got a lot steeper. And my son, in essence, replied to me, yes, but don't forget, we're pushing with you. And that heartens me endlessly. Both of my kids are pushing with me. I know that. And if we train the next generation, I'm a professor, I train rabbis. If we train the next generation to compassion, to sympathy, to speak out against harm, then we are in some part doing our job. And that is what I hope all of us do. As they used to sing, teach your children well.
Thank you. Making us all cry. Actually, that song, Teach Your Children Well, was my ringtone for a little moment in time, just FYI. Okay, Esther, I know you had something to
Yeah,
share.
I wanna wrestle with this question of silence and the pain that silence causes, because I agree with you. And I've been thinking more and more about it. It reminds me of the speech that the Rabbi Joachim Prinz gave at the 1963 March on Washington with King, who said the greatest problem is silence. And that's been one of my, that's my go-to text. I wanted to be a prophetic rabbi who spoke out against injustices, and I still believe in that. And one of the things I've been learning in this moment since October 7th, because one of the things that I've seen happen is the Jewish community pile on those who are silent very quickly, right? And then I've also seen groups respond too quickly that they haven't had time to take a measured look at what they're saying. And so I guess there's a part of me that I agree with you. I want us to be able to say, I see your pain, I acknowledge your pain, and it pains me. And I think we also need, I don't know if it's the combination of Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, and we're able to just we say whatever's on our mind right away, which I don't think actually is so useful to human relationships. Because you can sometimes say things and then there's a point of no return once you've opened your mouth. And so there's a part of me that also says, can we also have some take a deep breath, and when we're feeling like people should be saying stuff, maybe they're just also thinking. Maybe they're and I get it that some of us are extroverts, some of us are introverts. So some of us need to say things out loud in order to know what we should say. And some people have to say it to themselves and before they, I tend to be more of the former than the latter. But I think there's also been an element right now of anger that people are silent. And I wonder if we should need to also assume some good intent and be maybe they're just really, really trying to figure out what the heck is going on here, because they've never had to, because I know plenty of people who've been I literally don't understand. Like, all they know are the talking points. And also we've lost the ability to do nuance. So unless it's an 160 character tweet, they don't know how to process the like 100-year history we're talking about. So I'm just thinking, I don't have an answer. But I feel like there's two sides to the coin here. And eventually we need to get to the place where we can be allies with each other, and we shouldn't be silent.
I want to embrace that, Esther. There is a time for silence. I'm going to sound like Ecclesiastes. There's a time to speak out and a time for silence. And I have the good fortune to not be on any of the social media. So
God bless you.
If I speak out, it's usually because I've thought a bit before I do so, and I expect that of others. But I do understand that it can have a corrosive effect. And as it says in the Ethics of Our Fathers, Pirkei Avot, the son of Gamliel said, "All my life I have grown up among the sages, and I found nothing better than silence."
Right. And maybe we call it something
So
else. Maybe we just call it a pause, right? And I want to hear what Andrea's.
Or a breath. I mean,
Yes.
I think we need that so
Yes.
much. Andrea,
Yeah.
please jump in.
So yeah, I just want to speak out for somatics here. Just getting yourself grounded and breathing and actually crying all the way is really important, because there's so much grief and there's so much anger. And if we can get it out of our bodies, we can actually think and feel and see more clearly. And that will allow us to do what I wanted to add into this conversation. I want to go back to what Rabbi Elise was saying at the beginning, this meeting people where they're at. So if there is somebody who is in just deep, deep anguish, there is a reason they're there, and they need to be heard. And they may be thinking and feeling and saying things they never would under other circumstances. And if you can be there to witness their pain and their anguish until they've cried all the way, you might be able to get them to a place to engage. Eventually. And there was one more thing I wanted to say. Then, yes. Oh, I wanted to speak to Maureen, who's been doing apparently a lot of work. And she said that they're doing a lot of affinity work because people aren't ready to engage yet. Yes, meet people where they're at. And then find the people who are developing the capacity to talk again and create a space for them. That's what we've been doing in our space. We've been talking one-on-one with people who aren't ready to come back and talk with their cohort. We've been convening spaces for cohort members who want to come together. And we had this one gathering where it just blew me away. They all came with their curiosity for how one another perceiving what was happening in one another's worlds. And it's been that whole range for us. But you have to meet people where they're at. And if you have the capacity to really listen deeply, you can create an on-ramp for people to get human in a new way once again.
Thank you. Elise, I know you wanted to jump in on this too.
It's funny because when you were talking about silence at the beginning, Bert, I wasn't actually sure which direction you were going to go. And I think sometimes silence is actually really important. It could be a way of holding on to a relationship, especially when things are so hard. And I'll just share the story that, so October 7th was a Shabbat, the end of Sukkot. 2 days before that, Wednesday night in my sukkah, I hosted a Muslim colleague, friend, imam, who I respect greatly, who may even be on this call, I'm not sure. So I'm not going to say too much about it. But he's someone that I desperately would like to continue to develop a relationship. He's someone that has worked in multi-faith capacities for a long time, as have I. We don't know each other that well. We were beginning to build a relationship of trust. He had his young child in my sukkah. It was a wonderful evening. And then October 7th happened, and I didn't hear from him. And I was nervous about that. And I have no idea why I didn't hear from him. And it turned out, and after a few days, and originally my not hearing from him got me very upset. I was really anxious about what that was about and what was going on. And I thought of all these things I wanted to say about that. But I didn't, because the wiser part of my brain, in the voice of my husband, said, what is it that you want to get out of this? And I held on. And finally, several days later, I sent him a very, very quick note that said, I just want you to know that I'm thinking about you. And I know that you are in pain. And I know that you know that I'm in pain. And I don't know if we can find each other at this moment, but I don't want not speaking to each other to prevent us from finding each other again, or something along those lines. And he wrote back a note in which he explained that he had actually been traveling overseas. So, that shows us that my thinking that he wasn't reaching out to me was about me, which actually he was in Turkey. And so there was all of that, getting rid of the, breaking through the assumptions that we were very quick to make, but also to simply say, we may not be able to talk right now, but I'm not letting our silence or our inability to talk stop the potential of our relationship in the future. And I'm letting you know that now. I don't know that we could have had a conversation at that moment. I was broken. I still am broken. The pain of what has befallen people that I love, like Bert, is tremendous and immense, and I hold that very heavily. I don't know what conversation I can have now, but I know that I don't want to let go of the possibility of that conversation in the future. So there's a mixture of, it's not silence, reticence to say, I'm not sure what we can talk about, but I'm holding on to you even in my inability to talk. We'll catch up. And I can't give you the end of the story because it hasn't happened yet. But I actually believe that that's the right thing to do at this moment, is to deepen into the relationships we have with presence, however we can bring that presence, even if we cannot yet find the words.
Thank you. Yes to all shared. I just, as a community organizer, in my background, I just want to put out there the concept of one-to-ones. Having one-to-one conversations. It is what we have been doing so much of, as our team. Call someone, go visit them, just have a one-to-one and connect. And that is, and some of the pieces of what was shared and what can be done in that are relevant, and the other space is thinking about this metaphor of silence. Just oftentimes, especially in these moments, there's a lot of loud voices, loud messages, people wanting to get in there, whether that's sound bites, whether that's statements, whether that's all different kinds of ways, which, in some ways it's important, but also in some ways we're seeing a lot of problems and harm being done from that loudness, from that need to respond and take space with words, when sometimes there really are no words, and sometimes we just need to take a moment and breathe because we're in so much pain. So just to use that metaphor too of thinking about the loud voices, and something that Andrea mentioned even at the beginning of this call, the very beginning of this call, about how people have been stepping forward and in ways that she was not expecting, for that cohort to come together. She wasn't sure if the cohort would happen. Then October 7th happened, wasn't even sure, if that would happen, after that. But then they had this group come together and people want to connect. And that's a story that's not loud. It's not big and splashy. It's not getting uplifted enough. But those of us who are on this call, who want to have this conversation, those of these panelists, these incredible humans that are willing to have this conversation and navigate the challenges of this moment, like there are so many of us that are here and willing and wanting to make it better. Elise said, who wants to live in a world of hate? Who wants that? None of us do. And that is what, why, and how can we not care? Because who wants to live in that kind of world? And those are some of the I think, pieces that need to get uplifted in the space, that those loud voices don't oftentimes take up too much, and just to use that metaphor. So I'm looking at the time, and we started kind of moving in the direction, thanks to you all for engaging with the questions and answers, into practical tips, concrete steps that we can take. People listening in, we're about to enter the holiday season, and even this week, and the conversations we have around our table, with folks in our circles. What are some more concrete steps that we can take, to course correct each other, to call each other in, and invite people into thinking in a different way, in a way that is invitational, in a way that sees that there's a possibility for change, in a way that doesn't dehumanize and paint a community that thinks differently, or that is different in any way, as a monolith and with large, broad strokes. What are some concrete steps that we can take, those of us listening in? And I think this could be a speed round. So let's hear from all of you. Esther, start us off.
The sound bite. Do you want me to end in sort of the closing part? Why
not? Given the time. So to put the closings together, what's a concrete step that each of us can take? What do you want to tell the rest of America right now?
Oh my God, if only America could be on this call. Like, what a dream would be for like all the political parties, all of the people in our community. Get out of your limbic brain. So get out of the amygdala. That's the first thing. I want to take the Nina thing about taking a deep breath. Like, I want everyone to take a deep breath, take a pause, and don't react with your first reactions. That would be number one. 2, the relationships that you think you need to lean out of because you're upset are actually the relationships you need to lean into. And whether the leaning in is like, I'm actually going to give us a 2-week pause, or we're going to take, to Elise's point, we're not going to talk about this right now. That would be second. The third thing I would say, and this is really, I'm saying this exclusively to my community, to the Jewish community. I think we need to listen to the people we disagree with, really. And like, I say that to the right of our community. I say that to the left of our community. And I'll quote Liz Lerman. Amazing. I know you love Liz, Nina. Who's been a teacher of mine, been blessed by her, who used to say, who always, when she did our Yom Kippur afternoon service, would say, turn your discomfort into inquiry. And I realize, like, for those who think I'm saying that we're uncomfortable, we're heck of a lot more than uncomfortable. We are in deep, agonizing trauma. Okay. So, and I get it that it might be hard for us to turn our trauma into inquiry, but I think we need to be more curious and less judgmental. We need to listen to the young people in our community. I'm a Generation X. I need to be listening to millennials. I need to be listening to Generation Z and not judge everything. And try and say the brave things. This is my last comment. Who knew I was going to have so much to say, Nina? It was all just sitting in me. At the end, this comes from futurists that I've heard say this. Who are the ancestors we need to be for the future? So that is what I would like us, who've both inherited a mess, who are partially responsible for the mess, to think about the legacy of the future and not just worry about who we're going to get attacked by for saying something that seems unpopular, but is the brave thing to say. I will close with that.
Thank you. Who feels compelled? I see Elise, go for it.
So I have 2 very, very, very incredible small things. Well, one's small, one's big. I really, really want to go back to, how do we as Jews fight Islamophobia and anti-Semitism? I want us, it's going to sound so trite, but we need to practice saying to everybody around us at our table, not all Jews, not all Muslims, not all Arabs, 1,000 times. It's so important for Jews to be saying this in our homes right now when people are, speaking from pain, to recognize their pain. It's okay to have compassion for someone's pain without affirming their misguided statement. You can do that. You can say, I hear that you're hurting, and not all Arabs. I hear that you're in pain, and not all Jews. I hear that you're struggling, and not all Muslims. We have to say that 1,000 times and mean it, and not stand for that kind of broad brush speaking in our presence. We wouldn't accept it for anybody else. We wouldn't accept it for people who are African American. We wouldn't accept it for women. We wouldn't accept it for LGBTQ identified people. Why on earth would we accept that kind of broad brush speaking for people of Muslim backgrounds, of Arab backgrounds, or of Jewish backgrounds? Really important. Number two, and my panelists know that I'm going to say this, it's a really might seem tangential, but the thing that I was the most frightened of the past 3 weeks was when we read of the threats at Cornell University by someone who threatened to come in and shoot up the Jewish dining hall using an AR-15. He could have also said a mosque, right? Here's the thing that's going to make Muslims, Jews, and everybody else safer in America. Get Congress to reenact the assault weapons ban. The thing that makes us afraid is that we're going to go into our mosques and we're going to go into our synagogues and someone is going to come in and shoot us. We can actually stop that from happening, and we're not doing it. And that is really a shame. So you want to fight Islamophobia and the potential violence and the Islamophobia and anti-Semitism and its potential violence? Get Congress to pass an assault weapons ban. Soapbox dismounted.
I'm going to chime right in because we have 2 minutes left. Everything that everyone said so far, and tend to your fear, your anger, and your grief. Notice it. Don't let it get in your way. Don't let it turn into contempt or disgust. If you feel those feelings, that's when you need to slow down and remember everything everybody said so far. And when you're engaging with people you disagree with, as both speakers said, like, engage with compassion. Listen some more, and listen for the values. Listen to what they're angry about or what they're fearful of. And then they know they've been heard, and you can connect to that value that they have and talk about how you understand that value. And please get your news from trusted journalists of a number of different sides. We didn't get into this, but there is so much disinformation. And if you are getting your news from TikTok or from Instagram or from Facebook, you're probably not getting news, and you're probably passing on. You're getting riled up, which is it's designed to make that happen. And you shouldn't be getting more riled up than you need to be, and you shouldn't be rallying other people up more than is necessary. So look for trusted news sources across the spectrum.
I'm going to jump in now. First of all, I want to thank everybody on the screen, Nina, Andrea, Elise, and Esther, for their wisdom. I've gained a great deal from you. I went and grabbed the book so you can all see it, and I'm recommending it's still a very, very useful book, written both by Jews and by Muslims. And apropos something someone wrote in the chat or the Q&A, you should listen to your local leaders. I'm going to particularly call out 3 colleagues whose work I value very much: Sharon Brous in LA, or Rose in Boston, and Rolly Matalon here in New York. And let me end with the commandment that I think we should all live by: love your neighbor as yourself.
Thank you. Thank you for this wisdom. So we know that there are a lot of other questions that we didn't get to in the conversation. We want to honor your time. This is one of many conversations we want to have. We really welcome, truly, our team welcomes connecting with you. So if there's something that you want to unpack more, please reach out, and we're happy to point you to the resources, to the wisdom of these leaders here and beyond. So please get in touch with us. I shared in the chat a survey. This would help inform our future programming, help get a sense of how you are processing this particular conversation. Encourage you to share in the chat one word as you're leaving. This will, we'd love to hear from you, and we'll bring that up in the moment now. One word, one takeaway of what you're leaving from this conversation. I want to thank our panelists genuinely for your authenticity, your wisdom, your processing, and just all that you've shared in this space. Again, compassion. I see someone posted compassion. Want you to know, everyone, that this is one of many programs that we host, and there's more in the works, and there's also things that we can point you to that other great organizations are doing in this moment. Understanding, self-compassion, informed, empowered to engage, love. I just wanted to share what people are sharing in the chat so you all can see. Thank you all for joining and being a part of this. And hopeful, listen deeply. And just, again, gratitude for our panelists. Filled, someone shared. Please do fill out that survey. That helps us. We'll share it again in the chat.